4 in the morning in Wyoming looks like the bottom of a well. The sky has no light in it yet, only the promise of light, and the gravel lot of the diner is filled with machines instead of stars. 44 of them, chrome gone dull under sodium lamps, engines cooling in ticks and sighs like something breathing after a hard run. If you were driving past on the interstate right now, half asleep, you would slow down without knowing why. You would think, that is too many bikes for one truck stop. Too many men standing that still. Too much quiet for 4 in the morning. You would be right. Stay to the end of this and you'll understand what quiet like that actually means and what it costs to earn it. Subscribe if you've ever needed someone to stand between you and a door. Tell me what town you're watching this from tonight. 12 hours earlier, none of this existed. There was only a diner with a buzzing sign that said EAT missing its E, and a woman behind the counter who had learned, a long time ago, how to move through a room without disturbing the air in it. She refilled coffee cups the way some people pray, automatically, with her eyes somewhere else. She had waited tables at that diner for 6 years, through 2 owners and 1 flood that took out the walk-in freezer, and in all that time, she had never once let a customer see her hands shake. Not visibly, not in a way anyone could point to and name, but she knew the difference between a shake you could hide and one you couldn't. At the end of the counter, in the seat he always took, sat a man who came in most nights around midnight and left before the sun did anything but threaten. He wore a leather cut gone soft and gray at the seams, patches faded past reading, unless you already knew what they said. His knuckles were scarred in the particular way that meant they'd met something harder than they were, more than once. He drank his coffee black and said, most nights only 2 words to her, thank you, and even those he seemed to spend carefully, like a man rationing something he wasn't sure he'd get more of. She had never learned his name. She had learned, instead, the shape of his silence, how he sat with his back never quite to the door, how his eyes moved to the window every time a truck's headlights swept the lot, how he ate, like a man who'd once gone a long time without. She recognized that vigilance because she lived inside a version of it herself. Tonight she stood behind the register longer than usual, a paper napkin folded twice in her palm, feeling its edges soften with sweat before she'd even decided anything. Outside, the wind moved through the sage on the far side of the highway, and somewhere past the tree line, a dog was barking at nothing, or at something no one else could see yet. She walked toward his coffee cup. The clock above the pass-through read 11:51, and the diner had gone quiet in the way it always did, after the supper trade cleared out, and before the long haulers started drifting in from the interstate, hunting coffee, and a place to sit that wasn't a cab. 3 booths were occupied. An old rancher nursing pie he wasn't eating, a trucker asleep sitting up, cap pulled low, and him in the corner booth nearest the kitchen, the one with the clearest sightline to both doors, which she had noticed months ago was not an accident, the way nothing about him seemed to be an accident. She set the coffee pot down on the warmer and picked up the napkin again, turning it once in her fingers, like she might still change her mind. She had written it standing at the soda machine, back to the room, pen borrowed from the register drawer, hand shaking enough that she'd had to start over twice on the second line. He's coming back tonight. That much had come easy, the way true things sometimes do. The second line had taken longer. Please don't leave. 4 words. She had almost added his name to it, not the bikers, the other ones, and then hadn't, because writing his name felt like giving him more room in the world than he already took. She did not know, walking toward the corner booth, whether she was doing something brave or something foolish, and some detached part of her noted that she had stopped being able to tell those apart months ago, back around the time the restraining order had become a piece of paper in a drawer instead of a wall. The bell over the door did not ring. Nothing changed in the parking lot lighting. No headlights swept the window. It was only her, walking 12 feet across cracked linoleum, past the pie case with its slowly rotating shelf, past the smell of grease going cold on the flat top, toward a man who had said perhaps 60 words to her in the entire time she had known him. She refilled his cup first, because that was the excuse, the ordinary motion that would look like nothing to anyone watching, though no one was watching. Steam lifted between them. He did not look up right away. He never did. Not immediately. He gave a room a few seconds to prove itself before he committed his attention to it, a habit she had come to find, strangely, more reassuring than alarming. She slid the napkin under the base of the cup, folded side out, and did not say anything at all. Her hand lingered a half-second longer than the gesture required. Then she turned and walked back toward the register, wiping her palms on her apron as if she'd spilled something, as if her hands were only wet from the coffee pot, and behind her, she heard the particular stillness of a man reading something twice. Reeves read it the way he read everything that mattered, once fast, to catch the shape of the danger, and once slow, to catch the shape of the person who had written it. The handwriting told him more than the words did. The words were simple, almost childlike in their restraint, printed rather than scrawled, each letter pressed hard enough into the paper that he could feel the ridges on the underside with his thumb. "He's coming back tonight. Please don't leave." No signature, no need for one. But the pressure of the pen, the way the letters leaned rightward and then corrected themselves, straightened out like someone forcing their hand to behave, that was fear. He had seen that particular slant before, on visitation forms signed by women in prison waiting rooms, on custody papers passed across metal tables, on a letter his own mother had once written him that he still could not throw away. He did not look up. He folded the napkin once along its existing crease, the way a man folds something he intends to keep rather than discard, and set it in the breast pocket of his cut, over the patch that said what chapter he rode for and nothing else. Outside, the wind found a gap in the diner's siding and made a low sound, almost human, almost a question. He drank the coffee she had poured, because that too was part of the choreography now, the pretending that nothing had changed in the 6 feet of linoleum between the counter and the register. He watched her without watching her, a skill learned in yards and cell blocks, where looking directly at someone could be mistaken for a challenge, but not looking at all could get you killed by whatever you missed. She was refilling ketchup bottles that did not need refilling. Her shoulders sat higher than they had an hour ago, drawn up toward her ears, the posture of someone bracing for a hand that wasn't there yet, but had been there before, enough times that the body remembered on its own. He thought about walking to his bike and calling it in properly, the way the world told you to. He had done that once, 22 years old, in a different state, for a different woman, and he had watched the deputy take a report with the enthusiasm of a man filing paperwork on a stray dog, and 3 weeks later he had stood at a funeral where the flowers cost more than the man's bail had. He was not 22 anymore. He set the coffee down without finishing it, dug a phone out of a saddlebag pocket worn soft as leather gets after enough winters, and stepped out into the cold under a sky gone the color of a bruise healing, dialing a number he had not needed to use in 4 years, letting it ring once, twice, before a voice on the other end said his name like a question, and he said back, low and even, "I need the chapter." The voice on the other end did not ask why. That was the thing about the chapter that outsiders never understood. The thing that looked like blind loyalty to men who had never needed it and looked like oxygen to men who had. There was a pause, the particular silence of someone doing arithmetic in his head, miles, hours, who was sober enough to ride, and then the voice said, "Where?" And he told him, and the voice said, "How many?" And he said, "All of them." And there was no argument, no negotiation, just the sound of a screen door somewhere behind the voice, already moving. He stood in the gravel a while longer after the call ended, watching his own breath go up pale and disappear, the way a man watches something to keep from watching something else. Behind him, through the window glass gone soft with grease and years, he could see her clearing a booth 2 tables down from where the man had left his tip, could see her hands moving fast and efficient, the practiced choreography of someone who had learned that stillness invited questions, and questions invited attention she could not afford. She did not look toward the lot, she did not look toward him. She had already spent whatever it cost her to write 11 words on a napkin, and now she was doing what women like her had always done after asking for help, pretending she hadn't. He thought about his sister, briefly, the way he always did when the air went a certain kind of cold. 61 years old now, living 2 states over, and still flinching at raised voices 20 years after the man responsible had put himself in the ground with a bottle and a bad decision on a county road. He had not been there for her the way he wished he had been. He had been 18 and angry at everything except the right thing, and by the time he understood what anger was actually for, she had already learned to survive without him. That was the debt this life had handed him, unpaid and unpayable, and he had stopped trying to settle it directly a long time ago. He settled it sideways now. He settled it in gravel lots at 4 in the morning. The phone buzzed once against his palm, a name he recognized, then another, then 3 more in the time it took him to slide it back into the saddlebag. Men waking wives, pulling boots on in dark bedrooms, checking chains and oil by phone light, because the cold made rubber brittle, and nobody rode this time of year without checking. Somewhere 50 miles east, an engine that had been asleep since November coughed once and caught. He looked back through the glass one more time. She was pouring coffee for a trucker who hadn't asked for it, her hand steady now, or steady enough, and he understood that steadiness was a performance too, the last one she had left. The clock above the pie case read 3:52, and it had read that time, more or less, for as long as anyone in the county had been coming through this particular door, because the clock had stopped keeping honest hours sometime during the Bush administration, and nobody had cared enough to fix it. He liked that about the place. A clock that lied by staying still felt more honest than one that lied by moving forward and pretending the movement meant something. He set his boots flat on the gravel outside and listened to the wind work through the dead grass at the edge of the lot, a sound like something breathing through its teeth, and he thought about how weather in this part of Wyoming didn't arrive so much as it revealed itself, the cold already there under everything, waiting for the wind to peel back whatever thin cover the day had offered. The first headlight came over the rise at 4:06, a single point of white that grew slow and steady, the way a man rides when he's been riding 40 years and has stopped being impressed by his own speed. He recognized the rhythm of the engine before he could make out the shape of the rider, a particular unevenness in the idle that meant a carburetor nobody had gotten around to rebuilding, and he felt something in his chest unclench half an inch, not relief exactly, more like the first read on a gauge that tells you the machine hasn't failed yet. Behind the glass, she had stopped pouring coffee and was standing very still near the register, watching the light grow the way a person watches a storm they've already decided not to run from. He didn't go to her. He understood, in the specific way men understand things they've never been taught in words, that comfort offered too early curdles into pity, and pity was not what she needed from him or from anyone. What she needed was math. She needed to watch the number climb until the number itself became the argument, more convincing than anything a man could say through a screen door. By 4:14 there were 3 bikes in the lot, engines ticking as they cooled, 3 men standing loose-shouldered near the pumps not speaking, because there was nothing yet to say, and each of them knew better than to fill silence with noise just to prove they weren't afraid. One of them lit a cigarette and didn't offer the pack around, an old habit, a tell that he'd smoked alone in worse places than this. He nodded at the man once, got a nod back, and that was the whole conversation, the way it usually was among men who had already said everything that mattered to each other years ago, in rooms none of them talked about. 50 miles east, the sound of a 4th engine joined the first 3 somewhere out on the dark highway, closing the distance mile by patient mile, and he checked his phone again, and the number, quietly, kept climbing. Inside, the woman had stopped pretending to wipe down the counter. She stood near the register with both hands flat on the laminate, as if the diner itself might tip if she let go, and she watched the lot through the window the way a person watches weather that has not decided yet whether it will be a storm. The coffee maker hissed and finished its cycle, and she did not move to pour another pot. Somewhere behind her the radio played low, some station out of Casper that faded in and out with the wind, a woman's voice singing about a road that never led home, and nobody reached to turn it up or off. He came in once, just to stand near the door, not drinking anything, not asking anything, and she looked at him, the way a person looks at a fence line after the fence has already gone up, not with less fear, but with a different fear, one she could not name yet. He said nothing. He had learned long ago that reassurance offered too early sounded like a lie even when it wasn't one, so he let the bike speak instead, the way engines can when men choose to let them. By 4:40 there were 9, parked in a loose crescent along the gravel edge, headlights dark, kickstands down, the chrome gone dull and secretive under a sky that had not yet decided to lighten. Frost had started to form on the windshields of the two trucks left overnight in the far corner of the lot, and one of the new arrivals scraped a curl of it off with a thumbnail, studying it like a man reading a report. Nobody clustered too close to the windows. That was deliberate. They had learned, most of them the hard way, that a wall of men pressed against glass looks like a threat, while a loose scatter of men standing easy in the cold looks like something else. Patience, mostly, or the specific kind of waiting that belongs to people who are used to outlasting other people's nerve. He watched her through the window and noticed the exact moment she stopped counting the bikes herself, as if she'd reached some private number that was enough, at least for now, and had allowed herself to breathe out through her nose instead of her mouth. It was such a small thing. He filed it away the way he filed away everything useful, without remark, the way a man tracks whether he intends to survive. His phone buzzed once more against the vinyl seat of the booth. 10 miles out now, someone typed. Then, a minute later, another message, from a different number, 3 words only. Almost there, hold. He didn't answer either one. He just turned his cup a quarter turn on the saucer, an old habit, and looked back out at the dark where more headlights were beginning, faint and steady, to show themselves along the highway's black seam. Inside, the waitress had gone still behind the counter in the particular way of someone who has learned that movement draws the eye of men who should not be watching her. She was refilling the sugar dispensers, though none of them needed it, screwing the metal caps down tight, unscrewing them again, a task invented purely to keep her hands from shaking in plain sight. He noticed this too. He noticed the way she kept glancing at the clock above the pie case, an old Coca-Cola clock with a second hand that stuttered rather than swept, and the way her eyes would then drop to the parking lot and back to the clock, as though she were doing arithmetic with time itself, trying to calculate how much of it she had left before something crossed from possible into certain. The cook had come out from the back once, a heavy man with forearms scarred from decades of griddle burns, and stood in the pass-through doorway looking at the lot the way a man looks at weather he doesn't yet understand. He'd said nothing. He'd gone back to the grill, but he'd left the door between kitchen and counter propped open with a crate, which it had not been before, and the biker understood this too. Another small adjustment. Another person quietly deciding which side of the night they intended to stand on. Outside, the bikes kept arriving in 2s and 3s, engines dying into the cold with a settling tick, riders swinging off without hurry, without conversation, finding their places along the gravel's edge the way men find their places in a formation they've rehearsed 100 times without ever calling it a rehearsal. Nobody smoked. Nobody spoke above a murmur. A few checked their mirrors out of pure habit, though there was nothing behind them worth watching yet. The cold had a smell to it, diesel and frost and the mineral bite of high plains air before dawn, and he breathed it in through the cracked window of the booth and thought, without meaning to, of another lot, another cold, decades gone, when he had stood on the wrong side of a similar silence and understood too late what it meant. His cup was empty. He didn't call her over. He simply set it at the edge of the table, the way he always did, a small courtesy that had become, over the years, a kind of code between them, a signal that asked for nothing but presence. She came anyway, coffee pot trembling faintly in her grip, and poured, and this time, pouring, she let her eyes go to the window, to the growing constellation of headlamps strung out along the frontage road, and something in her shoulders loosened by 1 degree, though her hand did not stop shaking until the cup was full. She set the pot down on the counter and did not go back to the register. She stood instead at the edge of the pass-through window, where the kitchen light did not quite reach her, and watched the lot fill in, the way a river fills a dry wash after a storm somewhere upstream. Not all at once, but steadily, inevitably, until what had been empty ground was something else entirely. 41. 42. 2 more came in together, throttled low, their headlamps sweeping across the diner's front glass and then dying as the engines cut. The gravel took their weight without protest. It had taken heavier things before. He watched her watching them. There was a particular kind of stillness that came over people who had spent years learning to disappear inside a room, and he recognized it now the way he recognized weather, not as an idea, but as a pressure against the skin. She was doing the thing she always did when the diner was slow after midnight, running her thumb along the seam of her apron pocket, back and forth, as if testing whether something inside it was still there. He had never asked what it was. He suspected, now, that he already knew. A truck passed on the highway beyond the frontage road, engine climbing through its gears, headlights sweeping the ditch grass silver, and then gone. Nobody in the lot turned to look. They had already decided, without a word passed between them, which kind of arrival mattered and which did not, and a stranger's 18-wheeler hauling freight to Rapid City was not the kind that mattered. "You should sit," he said. Not a question, not quite an order either. She didn't sit. She untied her apron instead, folded it once, and set it on the counter beside the register, beneath the little brass hook where it hung during her breaks, though this was not a break, and both of them understood that. "He drives a gray truck," she said. Her voice came out flatter than the words deserved, as if she had practiced saying them without feeling. "Older model. Dented on the passenger side. He never fixed it." He said nothing. He let the silence hold the shape she'd given it. "He'll park across the road first," she said. "He always does that. Watches a while before he comes in anywhere." Outside, one of the riders near the propane cage lifted his chin toward the frontage road, toward a set of headlights that had slowed, then stopped, then killed themselves at the shoulder a quarter-mile off, engine idling low and patient in the dark like something that had done this before and meant to do it exactly the same way again. Reeves did not look at the headlights the way a man looks at a threat. He looked at them the way he'd once looked at a tripwire in a place he did not talk about, with a stillness that had nothing to do with calm. Behind him, he heard the diner's screen door groan on its spring and settle, and he knew without turning that the cook had come to stand in the frame with a spatula still in his hand, forgetting he was holding it. 44 bikes sat in the gravel lot, arranged now without anyone giving the order, a loose crescent facing the road, headlamps dark, engines cold, men leaning against seats and tank bags with their arms crossed, like they had nowhere else in the world to be. That was the trick of it. Not a wall, a patience. "He'll wait," she said, still standing with her folded apron beside her hip. "He likes to make people wonder if he's coming." "Let him wonder," Reeves said. She looked at him then, really looked, the way she hadn't allowed herself to, since she'd slid the napkin under his cup 3 hours before. There was something in her face that was not quite hope. Hope was too soft a word for it. It was closer to the look of someone doing arithmetic they'd done 100 times before, checking it again because the numbers had never once come out in her favor and she didn't trust them now. "You don't know him," she said. "No. He doesn't stop because people are standing there. He's stopped for less than this before. I believe you." She waited for him to say something else, some assurance, some promise stitched together out of the kind of words men used in movies. He didn't give her one. He had learned a long time ago, in a place with concrete floors and fluorescent light that never turned off, that promises were currency for men who had nothing else to spend, and he did not intend to be that kind of poor tonight. The headlights across the road did not move. Somewhere behind the diner, a chain-link gate ticked once in the wind, and the propane cage's hinge answered it, two small metal sounds passing a message back and forth in a language only the night understood. A rider near the pumps shifted his weight, and the gravel spoke under his boot, a sound too small to matter anywhere else, enormous here. Reeves reached over, without asking, and turned her coffee cup right side up on the counter, where it had sat cold and empty since she'd stopped pouring for anyone an hour ago. He filled it himself from the pot behind the register, the way he'd have filled his own. "Drink something," he said. "Your hands are going to need to stop shaking before he gets here." She looked down at them as if they belonged to someone else, and for the first time since he'd known her by name, on an order pad rather than by the sound of dread in her voice, she picked up the cup and did not spill it. Steam rose off the cup in a thin line that bent sideways when she breathed near it, and she watched that bend the way a person watches weather, looking for what it might mean about the hour ahead. He did not tell her it would be fine. He had learned a long time ago, in a place with no windows and a schedule that never once asked what he wanted, that the men who promised things would be fine were usually the men least equipped to make them so. He believed in coffee, and in the number of bikes in the lot, and not much else that could be said out loud. Outside, the count had not changed in 11 minutes, And that stillness had its own weight now, the kind that presses on a chest instead of a set of shoulders. 44 engines cooling in the dark made a sound as they settled, small ticks and sighs of metal giving up its heat, and if you had never heard it before, you might have mistaken it for breathing. He had heard it 1,000 times. He had come to trust it more than most rooms full of people. She set the cup down without a sound, which he noted the way he noted everything, filing it as a small victory. "He's done this before," she said. Not a question, not quite a confession either. Something closer to a fact she was setting on the counter between them, the way she might set down a check, because she had decided, in whatever private accounting people do at 3 in the morning, that he had earned the right to see the total. "How many times?" "I stopped counting after the 2nd year." She said it the way you'd give a mileage number on a truck that had long since stopped being worth repairing. Flat, factual, no self-pity riding along with it, and that flatness told him more than tears would have. Tears could be about the moment. This was about a whole architecture of moments, built over time, load-bearing. He thought of the block he'd shared a wall with once, and the particular quality of silence that came from a man who had learned exactly how far he could go before someone official had to notice. He did not say any of that to her. Some men in that yard had been building menus of restraint for the same reason gardeners keep pruning shears sharp: precision, not mercy. Outside, one of the parked bikes near the road tilted its mirror by 1/2 degree in the wind, and the reflection caught a set of headlights turning off the highway a 1/2 mile out, small and yellow and steady, moving at the unhurried speed of a man who believed the night still belonged to him. Reeves saw the headlights before anyone spoke, and the seeing did something to his shoulders that had nothing to do with fear. He had spent enough years learning the difference between a car that was lost and a car that was hunting, and this one moved like it already knew every turn in the road, like the town itself had been memorized the way a man memorizes the layout of a cell he expects to return to. He set his coffee down on the hood of a truck without looking at it. The gravel lot went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when everyone in it has decided, without saying so, that talking is finished for the night. She heard the change before she understood it. Her hand found the counter's edge, the way it must have found door frames and stair rails 100 times before, an old habit of bracing for something the body remembers, even when the mind is trying to be calm. "That's him," she said, and it wasn't a question, and nobody treated it like one. Reeves counted the seconds between the headlights dimming to parking lights and the engine cutting off, the way he used to count the seconds between a door closing down the hall and the sound of boots starting toward his own. 4, 5. A man in no hurry, because a man in no hurry has never once in his life had to be. The riders did not move toward the car. They simply stopped moving away from it, which was its own kind of statement. 40-some bodies rearranging themselves without a word into something that had shape and weight and no visible seam a person could slip through. Someone near the pumps folded his arms. Someone else shifted his boots 1/2 a step wider, the stance of a man settling in rather than a man preparing to run. Dana did not go to the window. She stayed exactly where she was, behind the counter, in the light, visible. And Reeves understood, watching her hold that ground, that this was the bravest thing he had seen a person do all night, braver than anything with fists in it. She was choosing to be seen instead of hidden, after years of being taught that being seen was the dangerous thing. The car door opened. It made the small metallic complaint that old car doors make, ordinary and almost gentle, absurd against everything it was about to carry into the light. A boot came down onto the gravel first, then a leg, then the rest of him unfolding slow, the way a man unfolds when he has rehearsed his own entrance 1,000 times in his head and believes tonight will go exactly the way all the other nights went. He straightened, looked toward the diner's glow, and stopped. Not from fear yet, only from arithmetic, the simple animal work of counting bikes and finding a number that did not match anything in his memory of this parking lot. He counted twice. Reeves watched him do it, the small twitch of the head, left to right, the way a man's eyes move when they are trying to make a number smaller by wishing at it. 44 bikes did not get smaller by wishing. They sat in their rows exactly as they had for hours, chrome dulled under the flat pre-dawn sky, patient as fence posts, and the man in the gravel lot stood very still in front of them, the way a deer stands still, not from calm, but from the particular paralysis that comes right before the body decides whether to run or to pretend it was never afraid at all. He chose pretending. Reeves had seen that choice made 100 times in a yard where pretending was the only currency anyone had. The shoulders came back. The chin lifted a half-inch, no more, just enough to say to himself that he had not flinched. He started walking toward the door, and it was the walk that told Reeves more than the tire iron he was not yet holding. A walk built for an empty diner and one woman behind a counter. A walk that had never once had to reckon with an audience. Nobody moved to stop him. That was the agreement, unspoken and total, that had settled over the lot sometime after 3. They would not meet him in the gravel, would not give him the satisfaction of a fight he could tell himself he'd lost fair. They would let him walk all the way to the glass, let him put his hand on that door, and let the door itself become the first thing in his life that had ever refused him. Reeves shifted his weight off the bike he'd been leaning against, unhurried, the way a man stands up from a porch chair. Beside him he heard boots on gravel, 4 sets, then 8, a slow gathering that made no announcement of itself, only presence, filling in the space between the pumps and the door, like water finding the low ground. Nobody spoke. The man's hand found the door handle and stopped there, fingers curled but not pulling, because through the glass he could now see what the lot had already told him and had not wanted to believe, that the diner itself was full of the same faces, backlit, unmoving, and that whatever this was had been built with him specifically in mind, weeks or months in the making, and he had walked into the middle of it believing it was still just a Tuesday night. Dana's hand tightened once around the edge of the counter, then let go. She did not look away from him. Reeves stepped up onto the walkway, close enough now that the streetlight caught the old scar under his jaw, and he said the first thing he had said out loud all night, low, almost gentle, the way you'd speak to someone you recognized from a long time ago. Cell Block D, Fort Grady. You had a different name for a while, but I remember the face. The man's hand did not move from the door handle, but something behind his eyes shifted, a recalculation, the kind a body makes when it realizes the ground it is standing on is not the ground it thought. He did not answer. Out here, men who had done that kind of time learned early that silence cost less than words, that words could be picked apart later and used against you, and so he gave nothing, only the flat stare of a man taking inventory of exits. Reeves did not blink. He had spent 11 years learning that stare from the inside of it, had worn it himself in a mirror bolted to a cinder block wall, and he knew what it meant and what it didn't. It didn't mean fear. Not yet. You did 4 years for something, Reeves said. I did 7 for something else. We were never friends, but I know your walk. I know it from 40 feet back in a chow line, and I know it right now. Behind him, the gravel had gone quiet in the particular way a lot goes quiet when 40 men are listening rather than moving, and beyond the glass the diner held its own version of that same stillness, the old fry cook motionless by the register, the trucker with the CB radio turned all the way down as if volume itself might tip something over. Dana stood exactly where she had stood for the last hour, both hands flat on the counter now, watching the back of a man she had married 9 years ago in a courthouse with no guests, watching him from a distance she had spent 3 years trying to build and had never quite trusted until this moment. There's a woman inside, Reeves said, who has a restraining order with your name on it and a court date you didn't show up to. You know that already. You know all of it. What you don't know is that I've spent 6 months in a cell no bigger than that pickup bed you're leaning your knuckles on, and I know exactly what a man like you tells himself in the dark to make it sound like love. The man's jaw worked once, a small motion, like something trying to find a door out of his own face and finding none. That's not why I'm here, he said, the first words he'd offered all night, and his voice cracked in the middle of it, thin and unconvincing even to himself. No, Reeves agreed. It's why I'm here. Somewhere behind the pumps, a bike's engine cooled with a soft metallic tick, the only sound for several seconds, and the man's eyes moved past Reeves's shoulder, counting faces the way a drowning man counts waves, looking for the one gap in the water that might still let him through. There wasn't one. The tire iron had not moved from his hand, but its weight had changed. He held it now, The way a man holds something he has forgotten why he picked up. An object without a purpose. A prop from an earlier scene that no longer applied. The cold had gotten into the steel and out again, and somewhere in that transfer the thing had stopped being a weapon and become only a piece of metal a man was ashamed to be found carrying. Nobody told him to drop it. That was the part that would stay with the ones who saw it, later, in versions they told to their own wives and sons, that no one raised a voice, no one raised a hand, and the man had lowered it himself, slowly, the way a dog lowers its ears before it lies down, some old animal calculus running underneath the human one, telling him the numbers were no longer in his favor and had not been for some time. Behind the glass, she had stopped pouring. The pot hung in her hand at an angle that would have spilled coffee across the counter if she'd been thinking about the coffee. She wasn't. She was watching the back of a head she had spent 3 years learning to read from a distance, the set of shoulders that meant something different from what it had meant in her kitchen at midnight, in her doorway at 2 in the morning, in the 11 months before the order had a case number attached to it. She had learned him the way you learn weather. She was watching him now, the way you'd watch a storm that had, for reasons you didn't yet trust, decided to pass north of the house. The man's mouth opened once more, and what came out was smaller than before. "She called you people," he said, and it wasn't a question, and it wasn't quite an accusation either. It was the sound of a man trying to locate blame in any direction that wasn't the mirror. "She didn't call anybody," Reeves said. "She wrote 4 words on a napkin because she was too scared to say them out loud, and that's a different thing than what you're describing, and you know the difference, because you're the reason she had to write instead of speak." The engine tick behind the pumps had stopped. The lot had gone fully still, 44 machines cooling in the dark like something that had run hard and finally arrived, and in that stillness the man's eyes made one more pass across the faces ringed around him. Patched vests, gray beards, arms crossed in the specific way of men who had done this kind of standing before, in places with worse lighting and higher stakes, and something in his shoulders gave up the argument his mouth was still trying to make. He looked, for one unguarded second, like a man much smaller than the one who had pulled into that lot 40 minutes earlier. Reeves watched that shrinking happen and felt no triumph in it at all, only the old, familiar weight of recognizing a shape he had once worn himself. The wind had come up sometime in the last hour, the way it did on the plains before dawn, carrying the smell of diesel and sage and the particular cold that settles into gravel lots after a long night. Nobody moved to fill the silence. That was the discipline of it, the thing outsiders never understood about men who rode together for years, that the power was never in what got said, it was in what got withheld, and 44 of them withholding it at once had a weight you could feel in your sternum. The man with the tire iron let it drop an inch, then another, until it hung loose at his side like something he'd forgotten he was holding. His restraining order violation, 3 months stale, sat between him and the ring of men, like a debt finally called due, in a currency he hadn't expected to need. He looked toward the diner window once, toward her, standing behind the glass with the phone still in her hand, though she hadn't dialed anything, hadn't needed to, and something crossed his face that wasn't quite shame, but was standing close enough to it to borrow its posture. Reeves didn't look away from him. That was the job right now, the only job, to be the fixed point the man's eyes kept returning to, the reminder that this parking lot had a memory older than tonight. He thought of the block, the fluorescent hum of it, the particular way certain men talked when they thought no guard was listening, the small cruelties they described like inventory. He thought of how long it had taken him, back then, to stop mistaking a quiet man for a safe one. "You're going to get in your truck," Reeves said, and his voice carried the flat, unhurried register of a man reading weather off a horizon. "And you're going to drive until Wyoming's behind you, and you're not going to come back to this lot, this town, or this woman. Not because I'm telling you to, because you already know what happens if you don't, and it isn't a call to the sheriff." The man's jaw worked once, twice, like he was chewing on a rebuttal that had gone dry in his mouth. Behind him, someone's boot shifted on gravel. Not a threat, just weight settling, the sound of 44 men breathing in the cold, and the man flinched at it anyway, small and involuntary, the flinch of someone whose body remembered violence even when his mouth still wanted to argue innocence. He got in the truck. The engine caught rough, coughed, caught again, and the headlights swept once across the ring of bikes before he pulled out onto the two-lane, tail lights shrinking into the dark toward the interstate. Nobody cheered. Nobody spoke. Reeves watched the red lights go small and then gone, and felt, beneath the relief, a colder thought settling in, that a man who'd learned patience like that, in a place like that, hadn't learned it only once, and hadn't learned it only on her. The gravel lot exhaled. That was the only word for it. The way the men loosened their shoulders in stages, the way breath came visible in the cold and then dispersed, 44 small clouds rising and thinning against a sky that hadn't decided yet whether it belonged to night or morning. Somewhere behind the diner, a compressor kicked on, the walk-in cooler cycling through its patient mechanical business, as if nothing had happened, as if the world outside its four walls hadn't just rearranged itself around a woman's fear. He didn't move toward the door yet. He stood where he'd stood, boots planted in the same 2 feet of gravel, and turned the thought over the way he'd once turned over a shank he'd found taped under a bunk, carefully, without touching the edge. A man didn't learn to fold that fast, to swallow that much rage and walk it back to a truck without one more word, unless folding had been beaten into him early, by someone bigger, someone with more time to work with. He knew that posture. He'd worn it himself once in a yard where mouthing off got you an extra 6 months and a busted orbital. He'd unlearned it slow, over years, the way a limb comes back after a cast, never quite the same, but usable. The screen door creaked. She stood in the frame with her apron still knotted at her waist, arms crossed tight against the cold, watching the empty road where the taillights had gone. She didn't ask if he was coming back. She already knew the shape of that particular silence. "You didn't have to stay out here," she said. Wasn't staying for him. She looked at the men still scattered across the lot, unmoving, patient as fence posts, and something in her face loosened a fraction, the way ice gives before it cracks. 44, she said, like she was counting them for the first time, out loud, to make it real. I keep doing the math and it still doesn't seem like a real number for a Tuesday. Wasn't planning on it either. Inside, someone had put a fresh pot on, and the smell of it drifted out through the propped door, ordinary and stubborn, insisting the world still ran on coffee and diner grease, no matter what had nearly happened in the dark. He should have felt lighter. He didn't. The cold thought from before had settled into his chest and taken root there, patient as a splinter working toward the surface. A man learns patience like that in one of two places, a cell block, or a house where somebody bigger made the rules early enough that patience became the only thing keeping you alive. He looked at her, at the way her eyes kept sliding toward the road even now, and understood, with the flat certainty of a man reading weather, that the story hadn't ended in that lot. It had only shown him its first page. He waited until the second pot had gone half empty before he asked her the question he'd been circling since the tire iron hit gravel. He kept his voice level, the way he'd learned to keep it level in rooms where volume got you noticed, and noticed got you hurt. How long? She didn't ask him to clarify. She understood exactly what he meant, and that understanding, more than the question itself, told him the answer would be worse than he'd guessed. 9 years, she said. Married for 6 of them, divorced for 3. He doesn't recognize the difference. She turned her coffee cup a quarter turn on the counter, not drinking from it, just needing something to do with her hands. The judge gave me a piece of paper. Paper doesn't stop a truck. Reeves thought about the restraining order sitting 3 months expired in some filing cabinet in a courthouse that closed at 4:30 and didn't answer its phones on weekends. He thought about how a piece of paper was a kind of prayer people made to institutions that had already proven they weren't listening. He say anything before? He doesn't say much before. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment she looked older than the light let her be, older than a woman ought to look at whatever age she was. The years sitting on her, the way frost sits on a windshield, thin, but everywhere. He says things during, and after, when he wants you to know it was your fault for making him do it. Outside, the sky had started to gray at its eastern seam, that first surrender before true light, and somewhere down the row of parked bikes, a man cleared his throat and spat into the gravel, the sound oddly comforting in its ordinariness. Reeves had heard men make that same admission she'd just made, in different words, across different tables, in a day room that smelled like bleach and old sweat. He had learned there that the timeline of a thing like this rarely started where the wound showed. It started years before, in a house nobody outside ever saw the inside of. "He ever hurt anybody else?" Reeves asked. "Before you?" The question landed harder than he'd meant it to. She looked at him for a long moment, and something crossed her face that wasn't quite recognition, and wasn't quite fear, but sat somewhere close to both, a held breath waiting to see if she should let it go. "Why would you ask it that way?" He didn't answer right away. He was thinking of a cell block, of a face he'd filed away 11 years ago, under Men to Remember. The kind of remembering that wasn't about anger, only about accuracy. The kind that told a man, later, when it mattered, that the story he was standing inside of had chapters nobody in this town had ever been shown. "Because I think I already know him," he said. Her hand went still on the counter, fingers flat against the laminate like she was trying to hold the surface down, keep it from tilting. "Know him how?" "Cheyenne facility," Reeves said. 11 years back. Different name on his paperwork than the one you've been saying, but the face doesn't change much. Neither does the walk. Man walks like he's still deciding whether the room respects him enough. She didn't ask what he'd been in for. That, more than anything, told Reeves she already understood the shape of it, had maybe always understood, in the way a person understands weather before it arrives, by the particular stillness of the air. He watched her take that stillness now, watched her set it down somewhere behind her sternum where she kept the things she couldn't afford to look at during a shift. Domestic, Reeves said anyway, because he thought she deserved the word spoken plain rather than left to guess. "Not you. Before you. There was a wife before you, near as I ever heard. Nobody talked about it much. Men in there don't advertise that particular charge, not to each other, but you learn to read a sentence sheet the way you learn to read a man's hands. His said 18 months. 18 months doesn't happen for a first offense." The coffee pot in her hand had gone unpoured for so long the steam off it had died down to nothing. She set it back on the burner without looking at it, an automatic motion, 30 years of muscle memory doing what her mind couldn't. "He told me he'd never done time," she said. Her voice had the flat quality of someone testing a board for rot before putting weight on it. "Told me the record was some other man with the same name. I believed him, because I wanted a version of him that started with me." "Most of them give you that story," Reeves said. "Ones like him always got a version where the wreckage started the day you walked in. Makes it easier to carry. For them, I mean. Never for the person standing where you're standing." Outside, the gravel lot had gone quiet under a sky just beginning to lighten at its eastern seam, the kind of gray that isn't yet color, only the promise of it. Somewhere past the pumps, a semi's brakes hissed and settled. Reeves found himself doing the arithmetic he'd trained himself to do without wanting to, counting years, counting names, counting the distance between a cell block in Cheyenne and a diner booth in a town nobody outside the county could find on a map, and the number that kept surfacing wasn't the 18 months. It was the wife before her, a name he didn't have, a woman who might still be out there somewhere, or might not be, and either way had never once been asked the question that was sitting now, unspoken, in the space between his coffee cup and her folded hands. He didn't ask it. Not then. There was a way of holding a question so it didn't fall on anyone, and he'd learned it the way he'd learned most things, by watching men who did it wrong and remembering the wreckage. He asked instead about the tattoo. "The bird," he said, "on his forearm. He have that back then?" She looked at him like the question had opened a drawer she'd shut years ago. "Got it after. Said it meant something. Freedom, he told me. I used to think that was almost funny, the way he said it, like the word belonged to him and not to anybody he'd ever locked a door on." "Cheyenne Inc., Reeves said, more to himself than to her. "Guy who did it worked out of the laundry room. Everybody got the same 3 birds, because he only knew the 3 birds." He turned his cup a quarter turn on its saucer. An old habit, checking a level that wasn't there. Means he got it inside, which means whatever you married was already finished becoming what it was before you ever poured him a cup of coffee. She didn't say anything to that. Her hands, still folded, went a shade tighter. knuckles rising like something surfacing. Outside the window, the gray was thinning into a color that wasn't quite blue yet, just the memory of blue arriving early. A rooster somewhere behind the lot, absurd and out of place, called once and quit. The men on the porch hadn't moved. 44 bikes stood in their rows, like a fence built out of intention instead of wood, dew starting to bead on the chrome, catching the coming light in small cold points. "You're not the first," he said finally. "Whatever he told you, you're not the first, and I don't think you're the second either. I think there's a woman before you nobody in this room has a name for, and I think about her sometimes when I can't sleep, which is most nights, so you understand. I've had time to think about it wrong from every direction there is. You don't know that." "No," he agreed. "I don't. But I know the shape of a man who's done this before, because I've watched men come out of Cheyenne carrying it like luggage, and he had that shape the first time he walked through your door, with a badge that wasn't real and a smile that was." She was quiet long enough that the diner's hum, the refrigerator case, the fluorescent tube over the register, the coffee maker cycling through its own small labor, filled in around the silence like water finding a low place. Then she said, so quietly he almost missed it under the hum, "I want to know who she was." Reeves looked at his coffee, gone cold an hour ago, and didn't drink it anyway. "So do I," he said. "But wanting to know, and being able to find out, are two different animals, and I've been chasing one my whole life, while the other one stayed out of reach." She untied her apron with the same motions she used every night, folding it in thirds along creases that had worn permanent, and set it on the counter like she was setting down something heavier than cloth. "Cheyenne's not that big," she said. "Not the part he'd have moved in. There's records. There's always records, even when men like that think there's smoke." "Records take lawyers," Reeves said. "Lawyers take money. I don't have either. I know a man who might." She said it carefully, the way people say things they've decided not to unsay. Retired, used to work parole hearings before his hands started shaking too bad to hold a pen. He comes through here Tuesdays, orders the same thing every time, dry wheat toast, black coffee, doesn't finish either one. She looked at Reeves like she was measuring whether he'd laugh at this, whether he'd tell her it was a fool's errand chasing a ghost through 30-year-old paperwork for a woman who might not even want to be found, who might be long past the reach of anyone's guilt. He didn't laugh. He turned his cup a quarter turn on the saucer, an old habit, something to do with his hands when his mind was somewhere else entirely, somewhere back down a hallway with cinder block walls, listening to a man in the next cell talk about women the way other men talked about weather, offhand, like nothing that happened to them was worth remembering by name. "You want me to talk to him?" Reeves said. It wasn't a question. "I want somebody besides me thinking about her," she said. "That's all. Somebody who isn't already drowning in it." Outside, past the window glass gone soft with morning condensation, the lot held its rows of bikes in the pale early light, chrome dulled with dew, leather seats beaded with it, 40-some machines standing patient as cattle at a fence line. A few of the men had started stirring, stretching out backs stiffened by hours propped against a tailgate, lighting the first cigarette of the day, saying nothing because there was nothing yet worth saying. Reeves watched them through the glass the way a man watches weather he trusts to hold. "Tuesday," he said. "I'll be here." She nodded, and for the first time since the note under the coffee cup, something in her shoulders loosened that had no business loosening yet, not with the story still open at both ends, not with a name still missing from it. But it loosened anyway. The morning shift came on at 7, a heavy-set woman with a coffee-stained apron who took one look at the lot full of motorcycles and did not ask a single question, only tied her apron tighter and started the second pot brewing without being told. Word traveled that way in small towns, not through explanation but through the sight of a thing that didn't need one. By 8, the diner had filled with truckers who'd seen the bikes from the highway and pulled off out of pure curiosity, and every one of them ordered eggs and kept their voices low, sensing without being told that this was not a room for loud talk. He sat at the counter through all of it, cup refilled twice, the note still folded once and tucked into the register drawer where she'd put it the night before. Not thrown away, not framed yet. That would come later, months from now, under glass, though neither of them knew that yet. He watched her work the floor the way she always had, quick and economical, no wasted motion, but there was a new steadiness in it now, the steadiness of a woman who had said the hardest sentence out loud and survived saying it. Around 9, the man who ran the salvage yard on the county road pulled in, saw the lot, and asked one of the younger riders what the occasion was. The rider, who did not know the whole of it, said only that they were waiting on something, and the salvage man nodded like that was answer enough and went inside for coffee, same as always. Reeves did not leave when his cup went empty a third time. He asked for eggs he didn't particularly want and ate them slow, watching the door the way he'd watched checkpoints once, years back, in a different uniform than the leather he wore now. Attention without appearance of attention, the old training that never fully left a man once it was in him. Somewhere past 10, he caught her eye across the counter, and she came over without being waved, coffee pot in hand, though his cup was still half full. "He doesn't usually come Tuesdays," she said, low enough that only he'd hear it. That was true once. "Meaning it's changing." "Meaning I don't know his patterns anymore. He's had time to make new ones." She topped off the cup, though it didn't need it, a reason to stand there a moment longer. "I keep thinking I know how this goes. I don't. Not this time." He didn't answer that with reassurance, because reassurance would have been a lie, and she'd have heard it as one. Instead, he said, "Then we don't guess. We watch." And outside, the lot held steady in the climbing sun, 40-some machines, and the men who rode them, settling into the particular patience of people who had learned, each in his own hard way, how to wait for something without flinching from what it might bring. The heat came up off the gravel in visible waves by noon, bending the far tree line into something liquid, and still no truck came down the county road, with the particular sound she said she'd know anywhere, a bad muffler and a habit of riding the brake on the curve past the grain elevator. He'd asked her once what the sound meant to her, and she'd said it meant get small, and he hadn't asked again. The men outside had stopped pretending to check their bikes an hour ago. They sat now in the shade of the building, on tailgates, on the concrete lip of the parking bumper, drinking coffee that had gone lukewarm in paper cups, and none of them spoke about leaving, because none of them had ever intended to. A man with a scar through one eyebrow played cards with another on the hood of a truck, not because the game mattered, but because hands needed something to do that wasn't checking a watch. Inside, she moved through her shift like a woman walking a floor she'd memorized in the dark, refilling cups, wiping counters already clean, glancing at the door each time the bell above it gave its small tin cry. A trucker came in for pie and left without noticing anything at all, which was its own kind of mercy, proof the world could still turn its ordinary gears around the edge of something this large. At 2, he took a walk to the edge of the lot, not far, just far enough to feel the sun full on the back of his neck, and to look down the road in both directions the way he used to look down a cell block, cataloging what could come from where. Nothing moved but heat. A hawk turned once over the field across the highway and dropped from sight behind a stand of dead cottonwoods, and he watched the place where it disappeared for longer than the hawk deserved, because watching was the only work available to him, and he'd long ago learned to do the work in front of him rather than the work he wished existed. When he came back, she was on the step outside the door, arms crossed against a cold that wasn't in the air, and she said, without looking at him, "You think today's the day." I think waiting long enough for something is its own kind of prediction. That's not an answer. No, he looked past her toward the road. It's what I've got instead of one. She almost smiled. It cost her something to nearly, and he saw the cost and said nothing about it, because some things a person had to carry the last little way themselves, and all he could offer was that he'd be standing there when she set it down. The car came at 6:40, when the light had gone the color of weak tea, and the gravel lot still held the day's heat in a way the air no longer did. He heard it before he saw it. A particular knock in the engine, valve trouble maybe, something a man who cared for his vehicle would have fixed years ago and never had, because caring for things had never been the point of him. It slowed at the turnoff the way a man slows when he already knows what he'll find and is deciding whether knowing changes anything. It didn't. The bikes had thinned through the afternoon, brothers rotating out for gas and food, and the small mercies of a body that needed rest. But at the sound of that engine, the lot filled again, the way water finds its own level. Men rising from where they'd been sitting on their tanks, or leaning against the block wall. Not hurrying, because hurrying was a thing you did when you were afraid of missing something, and none of them were afraid of that. He stood. She stood too, in the doorway, and he watched her hands, because hands told the truth a face had learned to lie about. Hers were still. Not calm, he knew the difference, but still the way a held breath is still, right before it becomes something else. The car stopped 40 feet out. The door didn't open right away. That was its own kind of information, the way a man sits in a car deciding what version of himself he's going to be when he steps out of it, and Reeves had spent enough years in rooms with men doing exactly that to know the shape of the weight. He counts them, she said, so quiet it barely disturbed the air. Before he does anything, he counts. Let him count. The door opened. He came out slow, one boot and then the other into the gravel, and straightened up into the last of the light, and for a moment nobody moved and nothing was said, and the whole lot held itself the way a held breath holds itself. 40-some men and one woman in a doorway, and one man in the dust, who had driven a long way to stand in front of a number he hadn't accounted for. His hand went to his waistband. Reeves didn't reach for anything. He'd learned that lesson in a yard 11 years ago, the lesson that stillness read louder than any weapon a man could carry, and he watched the hand, and watched the mouth, and waited for whichever one moved first, to tell him what the next 30 seconds were going to cost. The hand stopped at the waistband and stayed there, hovering, the way a man's hand hovers over a stove burner he isn't sure is still hot. Nobody breathed for him. Nobody breathed for anybody. The mouth worked once, twice, the jaw sliding sideways in a motion Reeves remembered from a cell block a decade gone, a tell that meant a man was doing arithmetic he didn't like the answer to. Then the hand came down empty. He said her name, just that. Said it the way a man says a word he thinks still has power in it, testing whether the old key still turns the old lock. It didn't. She didn't answer. She stood in the doorway with the light behind her and let the silence be her answer, and 44 men let their silence be hers. He looked at the patches. He looked longer than he needed to, cataloging them, and something crossed his face that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite shame, but sat somewhere in the country between the two. A man realizing the story he'd told himself about this town, about this woman, about what he was owed, had never once accounted for a night like this one. He took a step back toward the car. Nobody moved to stop him. That was the mercy in it. That leaving was still on the table, that no one closed the door on the only way out he had left. The county car came up the frontage road 11 minutes later, gravel popping under its tires, and the deputy who got out was young and wide-eyed at the size of the lot he'd been called to, and Reeves gave his statement in the flat, unadorned language of a man who had learned long ago that the truth needs no decoration to hold up in a report. The restraining order had a date on it. The date was old. The violation was clean, undisputed, and this time there were 44 witnesses instead of none. He did not come back after that night. Word moved through the diner the way word moves through small places, slow and certain, and by the following spring the story had softened into something people told with a kind of reverence. The note behind the register, the gravel lot at 4 in the morning, the number itself, 44, repeated like a psalm. She kept the napkin framed. The ink had faded some, but the words held. Reeves kept coming back too, same booth, same hour, and he never once let his cup sit empty, because a full cup, he'd learned, was its own kind of promise, that someone was still there, still watching, still willing to count the headlights coming up the highway, long after the world had told her nobody would.